Free trade, globalization, open markets, and foreign aid. For some, these are dirty words that raise the fearful specters of change and loss of control. In 1948, they are seen by the Western world, especially the US, as principles to stand by and embrace in order to promote peace and stability. It's not just fantasies about corporate bliss. No, it's a reasoned, calculated reaction to avoid a return to economic nationalism, protectionism, and trade tariffs that contributed to catapulting the world into 2 world wars. Yes, in 1948, the US becomes the champion of free trade, globalization, open markets, and foreign aid because they have concluded that it promotes peace and stability and serves Americans. This is the origin of the Marshall Plan and GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which will eventually become the World Trade Organization. Welcome to Season 1 of TimeGhost Cold War coverage in our series War to War, where we cover the events of the decade after World War II that brought man from the brink of destruction to the threshold of the stars. I'm Spartacus Olsson. Okay, by 1948, the US has concluded 2 things. 1, Europe needs to recover and stabilize economically to avoid social unrest and a resurgence of war. 2, promotion of free trade and open markets are essential to combat anti-democratic extremism, especially to thwart the spread of communist domination and socialist plan economy. Furthermore, promoting foreign growth is now viewed as the enlightened self-interest of the United States, potentially warding off a domestic economic downturn. The main driver behind the plans that emerge is former Chief of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the U.S. Armed Forces, now Secretary of State, George Marshall, who proposes and gives his name to the plan. He is joined by key European leaders like Foreign Secretary of the United Kingdom Ernest Bevin and French Foreign Minister Georges Bidault, who eagerly embrace Marshall's plan and co-champion it. In the U.S. Congress, Senator Arthur Vandenberg plays a crucial role in garnering supporters for what is at first viewed by many as an expensive, frivolous adventure in foreign aid. Meanwhile, on the other side of the newly fallen Iron Curtain, in Soviet-dominated Eastern Europe, the Kremlin, led by Premier Joseph Stalin and his Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov, continue on a path of protectionism and state-controlled imports and exports, but now extended to what will soon become the Communist Economic Bloc, Comecon. While their plans will cement Moscow's economic control of their newly acquired dominions, it will also force Eastern Europe into a slower post-war recovery, further deepen the East-West divide, and exasperate the differences that will hold the world on the brink of armed conflict in the Cold War. To fully grasp what Marshall, Bevin, Bidault, Vandenberg, and others are fighting for, we need to understand what to them in 1948 is obvious. How the interwar economy was a disastrous, self-destructive experiment in trying to promote national economic interests through protectionism and trade tariffs. Experiments that, by all reasonable analysis, contributed to the global depression, worsened that depression, and fed the howling dogs of war. Likewise, we need to understand why the Soviets not only resist, but are ideologically unable to embrace an open world economy, and from where their extended self-sufficiency, autarky, is coming from. With that, an episode about the early Cold War economy in 1948 must by force mostly be about the years between the 2 world wars, and we return to the end of the first of those wars in 1918. As the guns of war go silent, another far less visible global war begins, a world trade war. Spooked by the intricate interdependencies laid bare when the world was pulled into a war that turned out far more destructive than anyone could have believed, nations turn in on themselves, both for security and economically. It's based on 2 mistaken conclusions about the economics of the time. 1, that the globalization of commerce emerging in the first decade of the century left national economies weakened by fostering international competition. 2, that protectionism, specifically tariffs, will insulate national economies and boost agriculture, industry, and commerce at home. Why mistaken? Well, regarding the economy, World War or not, and like it or not, the nascent pre-war trend towards globalization did not come from some political or ideological desire, or for that matter, primarily for a capitalist interest in profit, but was a natural consequence of the increasingly industrial world economies being since long interdependent. Moreover, the reason for the Great War are elsewhere and far more complex than economic interdependency. In fact, the argument can be made, and has been made by many historians and economists, that the backlash against globalization just before the war, with the US and Germany among others imposing tariffs, worsened the multidimensional crisis that led to war. In the West, in the first years after the Great War, any such arguments that protectionism may have been part of the problem that led to war fall on deaf ears. And instead, the world heads straight into a slowly escalating trade war. For the US, it's a paradoxical situation. America is emerging as the lead creditor for recovery. In other words, both the states and private interests are investing into foreign growth. While one hand does that, the other imposes the Fordney-McCumber tariff in 1922, increasing duties on numerous imports, signaling a move towards increased protectionism. By then, one country, Bolshevik Russia, soon to be the Soviet Union, has already embraced protectionism fully. Following the Communist Revolution in 1917, the Soviets embark on an ideologically motivated path towards virtual self-sufficiency, or autarky, which leads to a policy of protectionism. In April 1918, the Kremlin establishes a foreign trade monopoly, which is managed by state-owned companies responsible for specific ranges of products. This monopoly is a consequence of the centrally planned nature of the Soviet economy, where domestic prices are fixed without direct regard to international market forces, which requires insulation from foreign competition. The effects on Soviet trade are substantial. Exports plummet from 1.5 billion rubles in 1913 to a mere 1 million rubles in 1920. Part of that can be attributed to the still raging Civil War, but even after the Reds finally defeat the Whites in 1922, Russia's engagement with the global economy remains significantly diminished. By 1926, its share of world trade stands at 1.2%, less than a third of its 1914 level. The trade that does occur is largely driven by the Soviet Union's need for capital goods to facilitate its industrialization drive. Even free trade proponent Great Britain starts drifting towards protectionism with the Safeguarding of Industries Act from 1921. Deliberately or not, the world is now caught in a tit-for-tat game of tariffs. In some cases, the language to describe the measures is as bellicose as actual conflict, like when Italy proclaims a battle for wheat in July 1925 with the imposition of tariffs on grain. Germany responds by introducing duties on wheat in 1926, while France introduces tariffs and milling quotas. It soon spreads to all of the Western world, with the likes of Canada, Spain, and Switzerland implementing tariff increases. The negative effects are measurable, but go unnoticed at first. To begin with, the tariff increases often aim to restore pre-World War I levels and are seen as a return to normalcy. Then there's the US economic boom and the return to growth in war-damaged France and Germany that mask global consequences. Although one should note that this boom is asymmetrical, with industry growing and agriculture already suffering severely from the trade war, an imbalance of economic opportunity between rural and urban populations that the Nazis will seize upon to assume power in Germany. In Japan and Great Britain, the boom is absent and they continue to face severe difficulties. That provides the final reason why it all goes unnoticed. With Great Britain on its economic knees, the previous champion of free trade is busy with its own problems, and there is no strong global leadership supporting open markets, contributing to a fragmented trade environment. But then, disaster hits when the still interconnected financial markets collapse in October 1929. A collapse arguably made worse by the escalating trade war. But instead of easing trade restrictions as the Great Depression sets in, protectionist policies intensify globally, further hindering economic recovery. In June 1930, the U.S. enacts the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, significantly raising tariff rates on a wide range of imports. 38 foreign governments issue formal protest against the passing of the bill, but to no avail. It sets off a cascade of actions that deepens the already dire financial crisis. As before, retaliation follows when countries including Spain, Switzerland, Italy, and Canada raise tariffs. The British Empire and her dominions, including Canada, try to insulate themselves by protecting free inter-imperial trade while imposing tariffs on imports into the empire through the Ottawa Agreement of August 1932. By that, in effect, Great Britain has fully abandoned free trade and imposed a 10% tariff on most goods imported into the world's largest economy. The tariffs and counter-tariffs continue to escalate and soon reach trade-halting levels. By 1931, the average tariffs on foodstuffs exceed 50% in France and reach over 80% in Germany, Romania, and Spain. Trade restrictions that now limit the flow of goods and hinder specialization and efficient resource allocation. Coupled with that, the flow of investment capital and credit system has now dried up after the stock market collapses. The world economy is now caught in a perfect economic storm. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union pursues collectivization of agriculture and a deadly push for construction of heavy industry, aiming for economic self-sufficiency and freedom from dependence on raw material imports. This is in one part motivated by military defense considerations, and in another part aimed to shield socialism from the economic downturns of the capitalist world. Soviet trade statistics, although arbitrarily kept, show a clear decline, with exports falling from a monthly average of 296 million in 1930 to 180 million in 1932 and to 75 million in early 1936. While diplomatic and commercial relations with the West expand after mid-1936, leading to a rapid increase in recorded export trade, the fundamental protectionist stance of the Soviet Union limits its integration into the global economy to an even larger degree than the non-communist countries. In Japan, the Smoot-Hawley tariff proves a significant blow, particularly to the vital Japanese silk industry. Silk's contribution to Japan's exports collapses from 36% in 1929 to a mere 13% by 1934. This contraction of overseas markets fuels an increasing desire for autarky here too. When the British Empire responds to the declining value of the yen with anti-Japanese tariffs and quotas, it further galvanizes national support for a regional economic bloc. Japan now increasingly focuses its trade within its sphere of influence, the yen bloc, with Manchuria, Taiwan, and Korea. Between 1929 and 1938, the proportion of Japanese exports destined for the yen bloc increases from 24% to 55%, while imports from this region rises from 20% to 41%. This inward economic orientation is further reinforced by the implementation of foreign exchange control laws in July 1932 and March 1933. Japan's imperial ambitions, evidenced by the conquest of Manchuria in September 1931 and its departure from the League of Nations in 1933, are immediately intertwined with this pursuit of economic security in an era of escalating trade barriers. As the 1930s progress in Europe, the fascist nations, especially Nazi Germany, also try to embrace autarky, adding yet more steps of escalation. Consumers across the world face rising prices and limited variety of products. In some instances, domestic protectionist policies like minimum prices for agricultural products in France also lead to higher prices for domestically produced products. The deflation of the Great Depression exacerbates this effect, as the fixed nominal tariffs are even larger percentage increases when import prices go down with deflation. Overall, tariffs contribute to a higher cost of living and reduced purchasing power for consumers, deepening the impact of high unemployment and lost opportunity. Altogether, the financial crisis, isolationism, desperate drives towards autarky, and the trade war literally tank the volume of world trade. Between 1929 and 1932, the value of global exports and imports measured in 1929 gold dollars falls to approximately 39%. While there is some recovery by 1937, the value of world trade remains at less than half of 1929 levels at around 46%. The effect is a prolonging of the global depression and a fragmentation of the world economy. It leaves most nations less economically prepared to address armed conflict when Germany invades Poland in 1939 and the world is again at war. By 1948, as the dust of that war is still settling, these economic mistakes that contributed to conflict are well analyzed and documented. There are voices in the West that still demand a harsh punitive economic policy against the former Axis countries, like the ones outlined in the never-pursued Morgenthau Plan to break Germany into continued submission by economic starvation. There are also voices, especially in the US Congress, calling for a return to national focus and avoiding any new expensive foreign adventures. Some Republicans even call the proposed plan a bottomless pit of wasteful altruism. In Moscow, the Soviets have not abandoned their adherence to centralized plan economy and consequently protectionism. But they have expanded and continue to expand their sphere of domination in Eastern Europe. And by that, their economic interests now include these territories. And right there, in that divide, is where the final push comes that motivates the Americans to proceed with the largest foreign investment project to that point in history and to tear down trade barriers in a move that will promote global economic development for 78 years until the spring of 2025. The specific event that pushes the scales is the Czechoslovak coup of 1948. When in February and March, the Moscow-backed communists seized power in the last still-standing democracy in the Soviet-dominated European sphere, it convinces most, if not all, doubters that to boost war-torn Western Europe is an existential necessity. Without US aid, there's a real risk that Europe as a whole will be overrun by communism. So, on April 3, 1948, U.S. President Truman signs the now congressionally approved European Recovery Program, soon to be known as the Marshall Plan. It will provide $15 billion, roughly $197 billion 2025, in aid for 16 countries, primarily in Western Europe. It will also set up a framework to boost private investment and tear down trade barriers between the US and Western Europe. In parallel, 23 nations, including the US, are already at work on the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade that went into effect on January 1st. Together, these two projects will propel the Western economies into a nearly miraculous recovery in an economic boom of the 1950s. Contrary to the fears of its initial detractors, the combined effect will also be to cement the US as the strongest and leading economy of the world. Meanwhile, the Kremlin blocks any of her dependencies from participating, and the Soviet sphere continues on its path of protectionism and expanded autarky. As a result, the balance in occupied Europe will shift, and the warning the U.S. commander of German occupation Lucius Clay issued that there is no choice between being a communist on 1,500 calories a day and a believer in democracy on 1,000 has been heard. Western Europe will be fed and will choose democracy. Recovery in Eastern Europe will be comparatively anemic, cementing not only a military and ideological iron curtain, but also one based on quality of life. While economic divisions will remain, and growth of the developed world will continue to be to some degree at the expense of the less developed world, a foundation has been laid for what will eventually lead to victory in the Cold War. A new economic order based on the sometimes hard-to-grasp but evident fact that between nations, economic success is not a zero-sum game. There doesn't have to be a loser for there to be a winner, because aiding each other in freedom promotes growth for everyone. The continued stellar rise of America in the second half of the 20th century also shows that standing as a beacon for those principles, being the guardian of economic freedom and success for others, is not self-destructive altruism. It's how you succeed. Excelsior!